The auctioneer's voice carried flat across the cold November air, the way sound does when there is nothing left in a field to stop it. Lot 47, one grandfather clock, antique tower-style oak casing fire damaged, no reserve. We'll open at $50. Nobody moved. There were 61 people at the Grayfall Municipal Asset Liquidation that Tuesday morning, the 12th of November, 2024. They stood in the parking lot behind the old town hall in their canvas coats and their worn boots' breath coming white in the cold coffee, going cold in their hands. The town hall itself stood behind them like a patient thing. Red brick gone gray with decades of Iowa winter's windows boarded since the last session. 3 years prior, a chain-link fence running the perimeter with orange construction notices zip-tied every 20 feet. Grayfall Rising. That was what the sign said. New development, new future. Groundbreaking Friday. The clock had been rolled out on a flatbed dolly by 2 young men in Mercer Capital polo shirts. It stood 8 feet tall, even with the finial cracked off the oak casing. Scorched dark along the left side from the base to the crown. The brass face warped and green with age. The hands stopped at 4 minutes past 11. It had stood in the lobby of the Grayfall Town Hall since 1911. It had survived 2 floods, 1 roof collapse, and a fire in 1971 that took the original building's north wing and 3 irreplaceable decades of municipal records. The clock had not survived unscathed. But it had survived. Roy Slade stood near the front with his hands in the pockets of his rust-colored jacket. He was 51 years old, heavy through the chest, with a clean-shaved face that stayed pink in the cold and dark eyes that moved over everything the way a man's eyes move when he is calculating weight and price simultaneously. Roy ran Slade Property Solutions, the biggest estate clearing operation between Des Moines and the Minnesota line. He bought whole buildings by the content, cleared them in a week, sold the pieces across 4 states. He had cleared the Grayfall Town Hall over the past month. The clock was the last piece. He had tried to open it himself 18 months ago when the asset inventory was first filed. Hired a man from Cedar Rapids who called himself a horological specialist. The man spent 4 hours and left, saying the fire damage to the movement housing had fused certain components in a way that would require full disassembly to access the interior. And that full disassembly would likely destroy whatever was inside. Roy had gone home that evening and made 2 phone calls, and then sat very still for a long time. He needed the clock gone. He needed it gone through proper channels. He needed it auctioned, publicly sold to someone who would take it home and put it in a garage and eventually throw it away when the wood finally gave up. He needed what was inside it to disappear without anyone being able to say Roy Slade had done anything wrong. $50, the auctioneer said again. "Do I have 50 a hand?" came up at the back of the crowd. Roy turned. He had not seen Wade Carver arrive. But there he was, standing at the edge of the lot near the fence, a lean man of 68 in a dark wool coat gone thin at the shoulders, wearing a canvas work cap, the color of old charcoal. He stood 6 feet tall with a slight stoop that had settled into his frame over decades of bending towards small work. His face was deeply lined, sun-darkened, despite a life spent mostly indoors, with pale gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that he wore pushed low on his nose. His hands were in his coat pockets. He had raised just 2 fingers above the pocket lip, barely enough motion to qualify as a bid. Wade Carver had run Carver Clock and Watch Repair on Depot Street in Grayfall for 41 years. Before that, his grandfather, Elias Carver, had run it for 33 years in the same building on the same street with the same hand-painted sign. The shop had no website. It had no social media presence. It had a phone that rang when someone called it, and a bell above the door that rang when someone entered, and a long wooden counter behind which Wade stood 6 days a week, surrounded by the sound of several hundred mechanical movements, all keeping time in their separate ways. a sound like a room full of quiet hearts. Wade fixed what other people had given up on. That was the whole of his business model, if it could be called that. People brought him things that were broken, and he made them run again. He charged what he thought was fair. He did not own a computer. He wrote his invoices by hand in a ledger that had his grandfather's handwriting in the first 40 pages, and his father's in the next 100, and his own in everything after. $50, said the auctioneer, and looked at the crowd. Going once. Roy Slade watched Wade Carver walk forward toward the flatbed dolly. He watched the old man crouch down, pull off his right glove with his teeth, and put 2 fingers to the brass face of the clock where the dial met the casing. He watched Wade close his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then Wade stood, put his glove back on, and looked at the auctioneer. Going twice. The big man to Roy's left laughed. It was the kind of laugh that is meant to be heard. He was Dale Briggs, who owned the farm equipment lot on Route 9 and had a voice built for county fairs. He said it loud enough for the whole front row to catch. $50 for a burned-up grandfather clock. Old man's gonna put it in his living room and tell people it's art. Several people smiled. 1 or 2 laughed outright. Sold, said the auctioneer. $50 to the gentleman in the back. Roy Slade did not smile. He watched Wade move toward the table to sign the purchase slip, and he felt something between relief and unease that he could not entirely separate. The old watchmaker. Of all people, Roy had seen Wade's shop, had driven past it 100 times, had always thought of it as a relic in itself, a thing the town kept around out of sentiment. The man inside it was the same. Nobody brought their watches to Wade Carver anymore, unless they were serious about a piece. Serious about craft, serious about keeping something that most people would have thrown away. Roy told himself it was fine. An old man and a burned clock. What could come of it? He told himself that for 3 days. Wade had a 1987 Ford pickup, dark green, that he had driven for 31 years without incident. He pulled it to the loading area, and 2 young men in polo shirts helped him slide the clock onto the bed with a moving blanket underneath it and 2 furniture straps across. Wade checked each strap himself, tugging each buckle twice before he was satisfied. He drove back to Depot Street at 25 miles an hour, with the hazard lights going, the clock riding behind him like a passenger who had been waiting a long time for a ride. The shop was narrow and deep, a converted storefront from the 1940s with a pressed tin ceiling and wooden floors worn pale along the paths that 40 years of foot traffic had made. The front counter was glass-topped, and inside the case were pocket watches and wristwatches on velvet trays. Things left for repair, things bought and waiting to be claimed. Behind the counter was the workbench, wide and deep and lit by 2 adjustable lamps covered in the instruments of the trade. Mainspring winders and jeweling tools and pivot polishers and a rack of screwdrivers so fine they looked like surgical instruments. A magnifier on a gooseneck arm. A mechanical timing machine that Wade's grandfather had bought in 1959, and that Wade still used because it worked. On the wall above the bench, hung on small hooks in no particular system that anyone else could have decoded, were dozens of movements in various states of completion. Pocket watch plates etched with maker's marks. Balance wheels smaller than a fingernail. Escape wheels of polished steel. Things too small to be understood by anyone who did not already understand them. Wade got the clock through the back door, using the same dolly the auction man had used, and a pair of furniture sliders his grandfather had left in the back room. He stood it against the east wall where the light was best, and he looked at it for a long time before he took off his coat. He had known what it was the moment he put his fingers to the face. An Ansonia regulator tower style, the deluxe commercial grade. Ansonia Clock Company. Brooklyn, New York. This model had been manufactured between 1906 and 1912. It had a Graham deadbeat escapement and a temperature-compensated pendulum, and a movement designed with the kind of precision that was not strictly necessary for a town hall lobby, but that someone had specified anyway, which meant someone had cared enough to spend the extra money, which meant the clock had been important to the people who ordered it. He had not seen a working Ansonia tower in 20 years. He had seen 4 total in his life. His grandfather had shown him one when Wade was 13 years old in a hotel lobby in Dubuque, and Elias Carver had said to the boy, "Put your ear against the case and listen." Wade had put his ear against the oak and heard the movement inside the slow, authoritative beat of the deadbeat. Escapement. Tick, pause, and Elias had said, "That is what a clock sounds like when the man who made it was not in a hurry." Wade stood before the Greyfall clock and thought about that. He thought about other things, too. He had been 14 years old in the summer of 1971, old enough to spend his afternoons in his grandfather's shop on Depot Street, old enough to be trusted with simple servicing and crown wheel cleaning, and the careful task of timing a movement on the bench, old enough to pay attention to the conversations men had when they thought a boy was not listening. He remembered that summer clearly. The fire at the town hall in August, the north wing, the record rooms, the original deed archive. He remembered Elias Carver coming home from the scene before the smoke had cleared, sitting down at the kitchen table and not saying anything for a long time. His grandfather was not a man who was easy to disturb. But that night he had been disturbed. Wade had not understood all of what he overheard that summer. He had been a boy. He understood more of it now. He took off his glasses and cleaned them and put them back on, and began his examination of the clock. The fire damage to the casing was superficial, in the way that fire damage to old oak sometimes is. The wood had charred on the surface and warped in 2 places along the left stile, but the joinery had held. The maker had used mortise and tenon construction throughout, no nails in the case frame, and the glue used in the original build had been hide glue, which chars rather than melts, which was part of why the casing had held its shape. Wade pressed his thumb along the charred surface and felt the wood solid underneath. The door to the movement compartment had warped in the fire and would not open cleanly, but it would open. Wade worked a thin palette knife into the gap at the top and ran it down slow, feeling the resistance, not forcing anything. The wood gave a 1/4 inch at the top, then the bottom, then the whole door came open, with a sound like a slow exhale. The interior of the case was dim and smelled of old oil and cedar, and something else underneath, something Wade associated with clock movements that had run a long time without service. A dry, metallic smell that was not unpleasant if you had grown up around it. He turned his work lamp toward the opening and looked in. The movement was there. The Ansonia 2-train weight-driven movement hanging in its original seat. The weights still on their cables, the pendulum resting against its backstop where it had settled when the clock last ran. The fire had not reached the interior of the case. The movement looked at first assessment, as though it had simply been stopped and left. Wade put on his magnifying headset and looked more carefully. The pivot points showed dry wear, which was to be expected for a movement that had been dormant for decades. The suspension spring was intact. The escape wheel teeth were present and undamaged. He turned the crown wheel with one finger very gently and felt the resistance of a movement that had not moved in a long time, but that was not seized. It wanted oil and time and patience, but it was not beyond saving. That was the first thing. The second thing he noticed took longer to see because it was not something wrong with the movement. It was something added to it, fitted very carefully between the back plate of the movement and the inner surface of the rear case panel, secured with 2 small brass screws that matched the original case. Hardware exactly was a thin steel box, roughly the dimensions of a hardcover book, painted matte black and flush against the wood, so that a casual eye would see nothing but the inside of a clock case. Wade looked at it for a long time without touching it. He had seen modifications before. People hid things in clock cases had always hidden things in clock cases. A clock was a piece of furniture that no one touched for years at a time. It was, in a sense, the ideal safe. But this modification was different from the kind that a homeowner makes, the kind where someone removes the back panel and tapes an envelope inside. This was machined. This was made to fit this specific clock in this specific location by someone who understood the clock's interior dimensions precisely. Someone who was either a clockmaker or had worked closely with one. Wade did not open it. He straightened up, removed his headset, and stood in the quiet of the shop with his hands at his sides and the sound of the other movements around him, keeping their small, faithful time. His grandfather, Elias Carver, had serviced the Grayfall Town Hall clock twice in Wade's lifetime. Once when Wade was 9 years old, which he did not remember clearly. Once when Wade was 16, which he did remember, because Elias had taken him along to assist, and it had been the most complex movement Wade had been permitted to observe up close at that age. That second service had been in the spring of 1972, 8 months after the fire. Wade remembered his grandfather working in the lobby of the rebuilt North Wing, the new plasterboard still smelling of fresh paint, and he remembered that Elias had spent considerably longer at the rear panel of the clock than the movement work strictly required. Wade had been asked to stand watch at the lobby door and let him know if anyone was coming. He had been 16. He had thought it was simply the way his grandfather worked, careful, unhurried, taking the full measure of a job. He thought about it differently now. Wade went to his workbench and sat down on his stool and opened the ledger to the current page and wrote the date and the lot number and the purchase price and the preliminary assessment in his small, even hand. He wrote without hurrying. He wrote the way his grandfather had written, which was to say he wrote as though the words would matter to someone someday, even if that someone was only himself reading it back. He did not write anything about the steel box. Outside on Depot Street, the afternoon light was going. The clock stood against the east wall with its door open, and the movement visible, and the black steel box fitted between the plate and the panel, invisible to anyone who did not know, to look for it patient, as a thing that has learned to wait. Wade closed the ledger and started the coffee maker and sat back down and thought. Roy Slade came to the shop the next morning before Wade had turned the sign to open. It was a gray Wednesday cold without wind, the kind of morning that settles over Iowa like a hand pressed flat on the landscape. Wade was at the bench when he heard the knock. 3 knocks businesslike, too early for a customer, and he went to the door and found Roy in his rust-colored jacket, with his breath coming white, and his pink face carrying an expression that was working hard to be casual. Wade let him in. Roy looked at the clock against the east wall. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is pretending not to have come to see. He said he had been thinking about the auction and had come to make Wade an offer. He said he had a client interested in antique tower clocks, a collector in Chicago, and he thought he might be able to move the piece for a fair price. He offered $8,000. Wade was pouring coffee. He did not turn around. He said he was not selling. Roy said he understood that, but had Wade considered the difficulty of restoration on a fire-damaged piece of this age? He said the parts were impossible to source. He said he knew a man in Chicago who had the resources to do it right. He said he was trying to help Wade avoid a restoration that could run $10,000–15,000 in parts and labor that the clock would never return in resale value. Wade set a cup on the counter. He did not set one for Roy. He said the clock was not for sale. Roy's easy expression tightened in a way he could not fully control. He looked at the clock again and this time did not bother to disguise that he was looking at it. He said, "Wade, I'll be straight with you. 25,000. Cash if you want. No paperwork necessary." The shop was quiet except for the movements on the wall. Wade looked at Roy Slade across the counter and thought about a Saturday in October of 1989, a day he had not thought about in years. But that came back to him now with the complete clarity that certain days carry no matter how long you go without visiting them. He thought about his father standing in the kitchen of the house on Whitfield Road, holding a check for $42,000 and looking at it the way a man looks at something that has defeated him, not with anger, but with a tiredness that goes all the way down. The house had been in the Carver family since 1931. The developer who bought it put up a strip mall. The strip mall went bankrupt in 1994, and the building sat empty for 11 years before it was torn down. Wade had been 33 years old that October. He had watched his father fold the check and put it in his shirt pocket, and he had told himself he would never watch that happen again to anything that belonged to this town. He told Roy Slade the clock was not for sale at any price. Roy left. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment outside the glass door, and Wade could see him through the window, standing still looking at his phone, not dialing anything, just looking at the screen. Then he walked to his truck and drove away. Wade turned the sign to open and went back to the bench. The story got around Grayfall the way stories always had, which was to say, it traveled in the hour before the grain elevator opened, and in the parking lot of the Lutheran church, and at the counter of the depot diner, where the same 6 men had been having the same argument about county road maintenance for 11 years. By Thursday afternoon, the consensus at the diner counter was that Wade Carver had paid $50 for a ruined antique that a Chicago collector was willing to buy for $25,000 and had turned it down, which meant either the old watchmaker had lost his senses or he knew something nobody else did. Dale Briggs, the man who had laughed at the auction, held court at the counter Thursday evening and said it was the former. He said Wade Carver had been alone in that shop so long he had started thinking like the clocks, which was to say he had stopped moving forward and was just going around and around the same wheel. He said this loud enough for the whole counter to hear, and some of the men laughed and some of them did not. And the ones who did not were the ones who had known Wade Carver longer. Gideon Mercer heard about the conversation the next morning. Mercer was 44 years old and had not spent a single night in Grayfall in the 14 months since Mercer Capital Group had acquired the town hall property and the 2 adjacent lots for $4.2 million. He stayed at a hotel in Des Moines when he needed to be in the area, and he conducted most of his business on his phone from a car. He was a lean man, dark-haired with the kind of composed face that expensive orthodontics and good suits produce in a certain kind of man, a face that communicated competence by communicating very little. He wore shoes that cost more than the monthly rent on Wade's shop. He had a Harvard MBA and 3 lawyers on retainer, and a groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for Friday morning that had been featured in the Des Moines Business Journal. His assistant, a young woman named Brianna, who was efficient in the way that people who are afraid of their employers tend to be efficient, brought him the information about the clock Thursday morning while he was in the back of a car between Des Moines and Grayfall for a site inspection. She said that a piece of municipal property from the town hall had been purchased at the liquidation auction by a local resident, that an associate of Mercer Capital had offered the man $25,000 for it and been refused, and that there were rumors in town that the piece in question might contain documents from the town hall's archive. Mercer looked out the window at the flat Iowa landscape for a moment. He said, "What kind of documents?" Brianna said she did not know specifically. Mercer called one of his lawyers and the conversation was short. Then he called Roy Slade. Roy answered on the first ring, which told Mercer something about Roy's current state of mind. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. After it ended, Mercer sat with his phone in his lap and his composed face composed a little harder than usual. And he thought about the groundbreaking ceremony on Friday, and the Des Moines Business Journal piece, and the $40 million of project financing that was contingent on breaking ground on schedule. And he decided that the situation with the old watchmaker needed to be resolved before Thursday was out. What Mercer did not know, sitting in the back of that car, was that Wade Carver had been at the town hall meetings every month for 11 years between 1971 and 1982. That Wade had sat in the third row on the left side with a yellow legal pad on his knee and taken notes on everything, not because he had been asked to, but because Elias Carver had told him once that a man owes his community his attention, at minimum, and that, if you want to understand why a place is the way it is, you attend its meetings and you write down what you hear. What Mercer did not know was that in the spring of 1975, Wade had sat in the third row and listened to a 2-hour argument about a land use clause that had been written into the original deed when the town hall property was sold to the municipality in 1968 by the Harlan family. A clause that gave the community of Grayfall the right of first purchase in the event the property was ever transferred out of municipal ownership. A clause that the town attorney at the time had called ironclad, and that the dissenting council member had called a ticking clock. Wade had written it all down. He still had the legal pad. It was in the third drawer of the filing cabinet next to the workbench under the 1978 and 1979 pads, and the 1980 service logs, and a rubber band that had gone brittle sometime in the 1990s. Wade had not opened that drawer in years, but he knew what was in it, the way you know where things are in a room you have lived in long enough. Thursday night, after he turned off the shop lights and locked the front door and the back door, Wade went to the east wall and stood before the Grayfall clock. He put on his headset and his work lamp, and he looked at the black steel box fitted between the plate and the rear panel. And he thought about his grandfather's hands, large and deliberate, moving through the interior of this case in a lobby that smelled of new plasterboard in the spring of 1972. He put his hand flat on the oak casing. The wood was cool and slightly rough under his palm where the fire had taken the finish. He could feel very faintly the stillness inside it. The absolute stillness of a movement that had not run in 53 years, but that was waiting the way a movement waits with no impatience and no complaint. He took a breath. He picked up his smallest reversing screwdriver. He was going to need the night. The first screw came out at 10:47 in the evening. Wade set it on the bench cloth beside his lamp, a brass wood screw no longer than his thumbnail, its threads still clean despite 53 years of waiting. His grandfather had used the right hardware. That was the kind of detail Elias Carver had always attended to, not because anyone would notice, but because he would know. The second screw was tighter. Wade did not force it. He applied a single drop of penetrating oil to the head and set the screwdriver down and waited 4 minutes by the wall clock above the bench, listening to the shop breathe around him. Somewhere in the middle distance, a truck moved through town on Route 12. And then the quiet came back, and the shop was just itself again, the ticking of the movements and the lamplight, and the smell of clock oil and old wood. He had been in this room for most of his adult life. He had married Carol here, not in the shop itself, but in the world that the shop sat at the center of the world of Grayfall and Depot Street, and the particular kind of life that a man builds when he decides that staying in a place and knowing it deeply is worth more than leaving it and knowing it not at all. Carol had understood that. She had been a school teacher for 31 years, and she had thought about her work the way Wade thought about his, which was to say, she thought it was not separable from the person doing it. When she died in 2019, the shop had been the thing that got Wade out of bed each morning, not because it was a distraction, but because it was a continuation. She would have wanted the movements kept running. She would have wanted the ledger kept current. That was the kind of woman she had been. He picked up the screwdriver and tried the second screw again, and it turned. By midnight, the box was free of its mounting. It sat on the bench cloth under the lamp, and Wade looked at it without touching it for a moment. It was steel cold to the touch when he finally picked it up, heavier than it appeared, roughly 9 inches by 6 by 1.5. The lid was fitted, not hinged, designed to be lifted straight up. Along the seam where the lid met the body, someone had run a thin bead of jeweler's wax, the kind used to seal watch cases against moisture. It had done its job. The wax was intact. Wade took his palette knife and ran it around the seam the way he would open a pocket watch case. Slow and even, no pressure, except what was necessary. The wax broke cleanly. He set the lid aside. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept its integrity in the sealed environment, were 3 items. A manila envelope, thick, sealed with a brad, and additionally taped along the flap. A smaller envelope of heavy cream paper, the kind used for legal correspondence in an earlier era, unsealed, the flap just tucked, and a single folded sheet of plain white paper, more recent than the others, its fold lines still sharp. Wade unfolded the plain sheet first. It was his grandfather's handwriting. He would have known it in a burning building. It read, "If you found this, you are the right person. You would not have gotten this far otherwise. The large envelope is for the town. Do not open it. Take it to an attorney you trust and tell them where it came from and when. The small envelope is for you. Read it when you are ready. I'm sorry I could not explain this while I was living. Some things have to wait for the right moment, and I did not know when that moment would be. I knew it would come. It always does, if the thing is built to last. Your grandfather, Elias." Wade sat with the paper in his hands for a long time. The wall clock above the bench read 12:41. Outside on Depot Street, the town was completely still, the way small Iowa towns are in the middle of November. Nights, a stillness that is not emptiness but patience, the stillness of a place that has been here long enough to know that mornings come. He set the plain sheet down and picked up the small cream envelope and held it for a moment, and then set it down too. Not yet. He was not ready for that yet. He looked at the large manila envelope. It was thick, perhaps 30 pages inside, maybe more. He could feel the rigidity of what he thought might be document covers through the oilcloth wrapping. He did not open it. Elias had been clear, and Elias was not a man who said things without meaning them precisely. Wade wrapped the contents back in the oilcloth, replaced them in the steel box, and put the lid back on. He set the box on the high shelf above the filing cabinet, where he kept reference manuals and parts catalogs between a 1967 Best Fit tool catalog and a bound volume of horological journal from 1958 that had belonged to Elias. It sat there looking like what it was, which was an old metal box among old books, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it was. He turned off the lamp and went upstairs to the apartment above the shop, and lay down on the bed without taking off his work clothes and looked at the ceiling in the dark. He thought about what Roy Slade had offered him and why. He thought about what $25,000 meant to a man like Roy, which was not much, which meant the thing Roy was buying was worth considerably more than $25,000 to someone. He thought about Gideon Mercer and the groundbreaking ceremony and the $40 million of project financing, and what a piece of paper from 1968 about a community right of first purchase might mean to a project like that. He thought about his grandfather in the lobby of the rebuilt town hall in the spring of 1972, working longer than the job required. He thought the clock was built to hold this. Elias had designed the box for this specific clock, which meant Elias had known in 1972 that the documents needed to be preserved somewhere, that would survive whatever came next, somewhere that would be maintained, somewhere that would be seen by the right person at the right time. A clock properly cared for outlasts almost everything else a town builds. Wade closed his eyes. He did not sleep much, but he slept some, and when he woke at 5:15, the sky outside the window was still black and the town was still quiet. And he lay there for 10 minutes, thinking about the small cream envelope on the shelf downstairs. And then he got up. He did not go back to the shelf. Oh, he made coffee and he opened the third drawer of the filing cabinet and he found the legal pads from 1975. And he sat at the bench and read his own handwriting from 49 years ago. The handwriting of a 21-year-old man in the third row on the left at a Gray Fall Town Council meeting, writing down everything he heard because his grandfather had told him to. He found what he was looking for on page 14 of the April 1975 pad. It was in his own words, not legal language, because he had not been trained in legal language at the time, and had written what he understood. But the substance was there. The Harlan family had insisted as a condition of the 1968 sale that the community of Gray Fall retain permanent right of first purchase if the property ever left municipal ownership. The town attorney at the time, a man named Cresswell, who had since been dead for 20 years, had said the clause was not standard but was binding and had been recorded with the deed. The dissenting council member, a woman named Patricia Doane, whom Wade remembered as a sharp-faced woman who sat very straight and did not suffer imprecision, had said that the clause would protect the town in perpetuity, unless it was formally dissolved by a 3/4 council vote on public record. There had never been such a vote. Wade would have known about it. He had attended every open council session until 1982, when Carol's first pregnancy had rearranged the geometry of his evenings, and he had never heard of one in the years since. He sat with the legal pad open on the bench and his coffee going cold beside him, and he thought about Gideon Mercer signing a purchase contract for $4.2 million in 2022, and about the lawyers who had reviewed that contract, and about what it means when the original recorded deed with its attached conditions is unavailable for review because it burned in a fire in 1971, and the only surviving copy is sealed in a steel box in a clock. He thought about Roy Slade, who had known or suspected what was in the box, and had spent 18 months trying to get it open or get it transferred to someone who would never find what was inside. Wade looked at the wall clock. It was 5:58 in the morning. Friday was in 26 hours. He picked up the phone and called the only attorney he had trusted in the last 30 years, a woman named Frances Holbrook, who had handled Carol's estate and who practiced out of an office on Meridian Street in Ames and who did not, to Wade's knowledge, do anything quickly, but did everything correctly. She answered on the fourth ring, which for 6 in the morning meant she was already at her desk, which was the kind of thing Wade had always respected about her. He told her he needed to come see her that day. He told her he had documents that might affect a real estate transaction, and that he needed her to look at them before Friday morning. He told her the transaction involved municipal property in Gray Fall. Frances Holbrook was quiet for a moment. Then she said she could see him at 2 in the afternoon. Wade said he would be there. He hung up and sat still for a moment, and then he heard it, a sound at the back of the building, not loud. A careful sound, the sound of someone who does not want to be heard trying the back door handle. The door was locked with a deadbolt. Wade had installed himself in 2003, using a Medico cylinder, which was the best residential lock manufactured in the United States at the time, and remained perfectly adequate for a clock repair shop in a small Iowa town. Whoever was at the back door tried the handle twice gently, and then there was silence. Wade did not move from the stool. After 2 minutes, he heard footsteps on the concrete of the back alley moving away. He sat with his coffee and his legal pad and the sound of the movements on the wall. and he thought about the fact that someone had just tried his back door at 6 in the morning, which meant that someone knew he had something they wanted and had decided that asking nicely through Roy Slade was no longer the preferred method. He got up and checked the front door. It was locked. He checked the windows along the side wall, all latched. The east wall where the clock stood was solid brick, no openings. He went back to the bench and sat down and made a list in the margin of the legal pad of everything he needed to do before 2 o'clock in Ames. The list had 4 items. Wade was a man who believed that a list with more than 4 items was not a list but a panic. Roy Slade appeared at the front door at 9:15 before Wade had unlocked it for the day. Wade saw him through the glass and went to the door and opened it and stepped aside and let him in without speaking. Roy came in and his eyes went immediately to the east wall and the clock standing there with its door closed, and then his eyes came back to Wade, and Roy's face had abandoned the casual expression entirely and replaced it with something more direct. He said he was going to be honest. Wade said that would be a change. Roy let that go. He said that the clock contained documents that pertained to a legal matter involving a current real estate transaction, and that those documents, if they said what certain parties believed they might say, could create significant complications for a project that represented a substantial investment in the future of Grayfall. Wade poured himself a second cup of coffee and did not offer Roy one this time either. Roy said that the parties involved were prepared to offer Wade $40,000 for the clock and its entire contents, sight unseen documents included, and that the offer was contingent on Wade signing a non-disclosure agreement and was available only until noon that day. Wade drank his coffee. He said Roy what happened to the Harlan deed. Roy went very still in the way that a man goes still when a conversation has arrived somewhere he was not prepared for. Wade said he remembered the original deed being filed in the municipal records in 1968 with an attached community rights clause, and that those records had been in the North Wing when it burned in 1971, and that he had always thought the loss of those records was a significant misfortune for the town, and that now he was finding himself curious about the nature of that misfortune. Roy said the fire was an accident. Everyone knew it was an accident. Wade said he was not accusing anyone of anything. He was just thinking out loud. Roy's pink face had gone a different color. He said the offer was $40,000 and it was more than fair. And Wade needed to understand that if those documents were what certain people believed they were, and if they became public record, the legal situation would be very complicated for a great number of people, and that Wade was not a lawyer and did not fully appreciate what he was holding. Wade set his cup down. He said, "Roy, I appreciate you coming by." He said the clock was not for sale, and he did not believe they had anything further to discuss. He said Roy should close the door on his way out because it was cold. Roy Slade stood in the middle of the shop for a moment with his jaw working at something he had decided not to say. Then he looked one last time at the clock on the east wall, a look that contained something Wade recognized as the specific desperation of a man watching a situation move beyond his ability to control it, and he left. Wade stood at the window and watched him get into his truck. Roy sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. He had his phone to his ear before he had cleared the parking spot. Mercer's man came at 11. He was not one of the lawyers. He was a younger man, mid-30s, in a gray overcoat with the careful manner of someone who has been trained to obtain things without appearing to demand them. He introduced himself as a representative of a private consulting firm retained by Mercer Capital Group, and said he was there to discuss the grandfather clock that Mr. Carver had purchased at Tuesday's auction. Wade was at the bench working on a mantel clock that had come in for service the previous week. He did not look up. The man said Mercer Capital was prepared to offer $100,000 for the clock. He said it as though the number were a courtesy rather than a strategy. Wade set down his screwdriver and looked at the man. He said he was going to ask him something directly and he expected a direct answer. The man said, "Of course." Wade said, "Does Gideon Mercer believe that there are documents in that clock that relate to the original 1968 Harlan deed and the community purchase rights clause attached to it?" The man's careful manner tightened fractionally, which was the only answer Wade needed. Wade said he was not interested in $100,000, and he was not interested in any other number. And he would appreciate it if Mercer Capital would direct any further communication to his attorney, whose name was Francis Holbrook, and whose office was in Ames. He wrote Francis's number on a piece of paper and handed it across the counter. The man in the gray overcoat looked at the paper, and then at Wade, and then at the clock on the east wall. And then he left. Wade went back to the mantel clock. At 12:30, he ate a sandwich at the bench and thought about whether to bring the steel box to Francis in Ames or to leave it where it was. He decided to leave it. The shop locks were adequate. The box was invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. And carrying the documents in his truck across 40 miles of Iowa highway with whatever interested parties were currently deployed in Grayfall seemed like an unnecessary risk. He would bring Francis to the documents, not the documents to Francis. He called her and told her this, and she said she would drive to Grayfall instead. And she would bring her associate Marcus Webb, who had 20 years of real property law. And she would be there at 3. He spent the early afternoon photographing every page of his 1975 legal pad with the camera on the phone his nephew had made him buy 2 years ago. He had not used the camera function before. It took him 20 minutes to work out the process. He sent the photographs to Francis's email address and then called her to confirm she had received them. And she said she had. And she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Wade, where did you get this?" He told her about the town council meetings and the third row on the left and his grandfather's instruction to pay attention. She said she would see him at 3. What happened in the 2 hours between 12:30 and 2:30 was something Wade did not witness but pieced together later from what Ada Flynn published the following week, and from what Francis told him and from what Roy Slade eventually said in a deposition that became part of the public record. Mercer's lawyers had spent Thursday night and Friday morning trying to locate the original Harlan deed through every available channel. They had searched the Calhoun County Recorder's Office, the state archives in Des Moines, the Iowa State Historical Society, and 3 separate title insurance companies that had been involved in transactions touching the property over the decades. They found references to the deed. They found the recorded instrument number. They could not find the deed itself because the original had been in the North Wing in August of 1971, and the certified copy that should have existed in a secondary archive had never been filed, an oversight that the town attorney of that era, the late Mr. Cresswell, appeared to have failed to correct. What Mercer's lawyers had also done during those same hours was obtain an emergency court order from a district court judge in Des Moines, a judge who had a professional relationship with one of Mercer's retainer firms, requiring Wade Carver to surrender for inspection any documents in his possession relating to municipal property of the town of Grayfall. The order had been signed at 1:15 in the afternoon. Mercer's lead attorney, a man named Pierce, who Wade would meet before the day was out, had called it ironclad. What Pierce did not know at 1:15 was that Francis Holbrook had been on the phone with the Calhoun County Recorder's Office since 11 that morning. What he did not know was that the recorder, a methodical woman named Judith Akers, who had held the position for 16 years, had found in her predecessor's files in a cardboard box that had been sitting on a metal shelf in the basement archive since 1994, a document that Judith described to Francis as appearing to be an original notarized copy of the 1968 property transfer agreement between the Harlan family and the municipality of Grayfall, with a 2-page attachment. What Pierce did not know was that Judith Akers had photographed all 11 pages of that document on her office scanner at 12:47 in the afternoon and had emailed them to Francis Holbrook and to the Calhoun County Attorney's office simultaneously, and that the Calhoun County Attorney, a man named Gerald Dix, who had been in office for 9 years and who did not enjoy being surprised by private developers with Des Moines court orders, had called 3 people in the subsequent hour, one of whom was a judge. Gideon Mercer arrived in Grayfall at 2:40 in a black Escalade with Pierce in the passenger seat and 2 other lawyers in the back. He had not planned to come himself. He had planned to send Pierce and the court order and have the matter resolved by 3 o'clock, allowing him to hold the groundbreaking ceremony Friday morning on schedule and continue with the $40 million of project financing and the Des Moines Business Journal piece and the future he had arranged for himself. He came because Pierce called him at 2:15 and said things had become complicated and that his presence might be necessary. Wade heard the Escalade pull up on Depot Street at 2:44 because he had been listening for it, and because the engine of a large luxury SUV in a quiet, small-town afternoon is not a subtle sound. He was standing at the workbench with the steel box open in front of him and the manila envelope in his hands, and Frances Holbrook beside him, and her associate Marcus Webb at the end of the bench with his own documents spread before him. Frances had arrived at 2 sharp. She had read the 1975 legal pad. She had reviewed the photographs. She had spent 40 minutes on the phone with Gerald Dix. She had looked at the manila envelope in the steel box, but had not opened it, agreeing with Wade that it should be opened in the presence of the county attorney or a neutral party. She was a small woman of 63, with silver hair, cut practical and short, and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and a manner so unhurried and precise that it made the air around her feel more organized. She had said to Wade when he asked her what she thought that the situation appeared to involve a property transfer that had occurred without proper disclosure of an encumbering covenant, and that if the covenant was what the 1975 notes suggested, and was confirmed by the contents of the envelope, then the transfer was likely voidable, which meant the groundbreaking on Friday was likely not going to happen as planned. Wade had said, "What about the court order?" Frances had said, "What court order?" Pierce came through the front door of the shop at 2:49 with the 2 junior lawyers behind him. Mercer came last, which was his habit, and stood just inside the door looking at the room with the composed expression that had served him well in a great many rooms. His eyes went to the clock on the east wall, then to the open steel box on the bench, then to the manila envelope in Wade's hands, then to Frances Holbrook, who he did not recognize, and then to Wade. Pierce began to speak. He had a prepared statement about the court order and the legal obligation to surrender documents, and he delivered it with the fluency of a man who had delivered similar statements many times in rooms where the delivery had been sufficient. Frances Holbrook let him finish. Then she handed him a document of her own. It was a filing made at 3:47 that afternoon, with the Calhoun County Court citing the newly recovered deed copy from Judith Akers at the county recorder's office and petitioning for an emergency injunction against any transfer or destruction of related property documents and against any groundbreaking or construction activity on the town hall site, pending review of the 1968 conveyance covenant. Pierce read it. He read it a second time. The 2 junior lawyers looked at each other. Mercer had not moved from his position just inside the door. He was looking at Wade Carver, who was standing at his workbench in his work clothes with the manila envelope in his hands and his wire-rimmed glasses on his nose, and the sound of several hundred mechanical movements keeping their patient time around him. Mercer was 44 years old and had not often been in a room where the situation was not developing in his favor, and his composed face was working at its composure with more visible effort than usual. Wade set the manila envelope down on the bench cloth. He had not opened it. He would not open it until Gerald Dix arrived, which Francis had said would be within the hour. He would hand it over intact, the way his grandfather had instructed to an attorney he trusted. He had done what Elias had asked. The rest was for other people to do. He looked at Gideon Mercer across the length of the shop. Mercer looked back at him. The clock on the east wall stood silent in its casing. Its movement still, its hands stopped at 4 minutes past 11. It had been waiting 53 years for this particular Friday afternoon. It did not appear, as far as Wade could tell, to find the wait remarkable in any way. It had simply kept the faith that a well-made thing keeps, that the right moment comes, if you are built to last until it arrives. Outside on Depot Street, the November afternoon was going dark, the way Iowa afternoons go dark in November early, and complete the sky pressing down flat and gray over the town. Inside the shop, the lamps were lit, and the movements were running, and Pierce was on his phone in the corner, and the two junior lawyers were conferring in low voices, and Francis Holbrook was writing in a legal pad with the quick, certain hand of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. And Mercer was still standing just inside the door, very still now, looking at nothing in particular. Roy Slade never came back to the shop. He called Wade's number twice that evening, and Wade let it ring both times and did not return the calls. Gerald Dix arrived at 4:20 with a paralegal and a court reporter, and the methodical patience of a county attorney who had seen a great many things and who approached each new one with the same measured attention. He was 61 years old, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, and the kind of slow speech that conceals rather than betrays intelligence. He shook Wade's hand and looked at the steel box on the bench, and then at the manila envelope, and then at Francis. And Francis gave him the summary in 4 minutes flat. Dix asked Wade if he was prepared to surrender the envelope to the county attorney's office as a matter of public record. Wade said that was exactly what his grandfather had intended. Dix took the envelope. He did not open it in the shop. He said it would be opened in his office with a full witness record, and that copies would be filed with the court and the county recorder, and that Wade would receive notification of the contents within 48 hours. He looked at Pierce, who had ended his phone call, and was standing against the wall with an expression that Pierce probably thought was neutral. Dix said he assumed Mercer Capital's counsel would want to be present at the opening. Pierce said he would be there. Dix said he looked forward to it. He said it the way a man says something he completely means, in a way that is also a warning. Mercer left the shop before Dix was done speaking. Wade heard the Escalade start on Depot Street and pull away. He stood at the workbench after they had all gone. Francis and Marcus and Dix and his paralegal and the court reporter stood in the quiet of the shop with the movements around him, and the empty steel box on the bench, and the clock on the east wall, still holding its stop time. He picked up the small cream envelope from the shelf where he had placed it 2 days ago. He sat on his stool and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper folded twice. At the top, in Elias Carver's hand, was a date, September 4th, 1972. Below it, the letter was brief. Elias had not been a man who used words he did not need. It said, "I put the documents in the clock, because the clock will outlast the people trying to bury them. I do not know who will find this or when. I know it will be someone who listened to the movement first, which means it will be someone who understands that a thing does not stop being true because it becomes inconvenient. I spent my whole life fixing what people had given up on. I hope you spend yours the same way. If you are my grandson reading this, I hope you know that the shop was always going to be yours, and I always knew you would know what to do with it. Take care of the movements. They remember everything. Your grandfather, Elias." Wade sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. The wall clock above the bench read 5:48. Outside Depot Street was dark and quiet. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant the shop opened at 8, and he had 3 movements on the bench waiting for attention, and a customer coming at 10 to pick up a pocket watch that had belonged to her father. He folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the cream envelope and set it in the 3rd drawer of the filing cabinet, on top of the 1975 legal pad, where it would be safe and where he would know where it was. He turned off the bench lamp. He sat in the dark shop for a moment and listened to the movements, all of them keeping their separate, faithful time in the dark around him. And he thought about his grandfather's hands and about the clock on the east wall that had waited 53 years for the right person, and about the town of Grayfall, sleeping outside in the November night, not yet knowing what tomorrow would bring. Then he got up and went upstairs because there was work in the morning, and he had always believed that the best thing a man could do after a long day was rest, so that he could do the work right. He slept 6 hours, which was more than he had expected. When he came downstairs at 5:40 Saturday morning, the shop was exactly as he had left it. The bench lamp off the movements running in the dark, the steel box empty on the bench cloth, the clock on the east wall holding its stop time, with the patience of something that has learned to measure itself in decades rather than minutes. Wade turned on the bench lamp and put water on for coffee and stood in the early quiet of the shop and let the sound of the movements settle around him, the way it always had, the way it had when he was a boy, sitting on a stool watching his grandfather work, the way it had on every morning of his adult life in this building, on this street, in this town. Some things a man returns to, not because he has never left, but because leaving and returning are the same motion when the place is the right one. He poured his coffee and sat at the bench and opened the service log to the current page and looked at the 3 movements waiting for him. A Seth Thomas mantel clock, a Hamilton Railroad grade pocket watch needing a mainspring, and an anniversary clock with a bent suspension spring that its owner had brought in inside a shoebox, with a handwritten note that said, "Please help," taped to the lid. Wade had smiled at that note when it arrived. He smiled at it again now. He picked up the Seth Thomas and got to work. At 7:58, Frances Holbrook called. Wade set down his tweezers and answered. She said Gerald Dix had opened the manila envelope at 7 that morning in his office, with Pierce present, and 2 witnesses and a court reporter. She said the envelope had contained 12 pages. She said the first 8 pages were a photographic reproduction of the original, 1968 Harlan deed, and its attached covenant, the reproduction having been made according to a notation in Elias Carver's handwriting on the cover sheet on the 14th of August, 1971, 4 days before the fire. Elias had known someone with access to a commercial document camera, which in 1971 was not a common piece of equipment, and he had used that access before the original was lost. Frances paused for a moment, and in that pause Wade understood that she was a woman who did not pause without reason. She said the remaining 4 pages were a signed affidavit, notarized September 4th, 1972, the same date as the letter to Wade in which Elias Carver stated that he had witnessed on the evening of August 17th, 1971, a conversation between Roy Slade's father, a man named Bernard Slade, and the town attorney Chester Cresswell, in which Bernard Slade had offered Cresswell $2,000 to ensure that the certified copy of the Harlan deed was not filed in the secondary archive before the records were destroyed. Elias had named the location of the conversation, the time, and the 2 witnesses who had been present without knowing what they were witnessing. Wade sat with the phone against his ear and looked at the Seth Thomas movement on the bench in front of him. He said, "Did Dick say what happens now?" Frances said the Calhoun County Attorney's Office was filing a formal challenge to the 2022 transfer of the town hall property on the grounds that the covenant had not been disclosed, which constituted a material defect in the conveyance, and that the transfer was therefore voidable at the election of the town. She said Mercer Capital's attorneys had requested an emergency meeting with Dix for Monday morning. She said Pierce had not spoken during the envelope opening. He had read the affidavit twice, and then asked for a copy, and then sat very still for several minutes before he left. Wade thanked her. She said, "Wade, your grandfather, put himself at considerable risk making that affidavit. Bernard Slade was not a small presence in this county in 1972. Wade said he knew that. She said Elias must have believed the documents would be found at a moment when it mattered enough to act on them. Wade said he believed the clock would be found by someone who would know what to do with what was inside it. He said his grandfather had always trusted the right tool for the right job. Frances said she will be in touch Monday and to call her if anything developed over the weekend." Wade set the phone down and picked up his tweezers and went back to the Seth Thomas. The customer came for the pocket watch at 10 o'clock. She was a woman of about 50 named Lorraine Briggs, no relation to Dale, who had driven from Marshalltown with the watch in a velvet pouch in her coat pocket. Her father had carried it for 30 years on the Burlington Northern and had left it to her when he died in the spring. The watch was a Hamilton 992 B17 jewel, a railroad-grade movement of considerable quality, and Wade had spent 4 hours on it across 2 evenings that week, cleaning and oiling the movement and replacing the mainspring and regulating it on the timing machine until it was running within 8 seconds per day, which for a watch of that age was as good as it had originally left the factory. He brought it out from the bench and set it on the glass counter and opened the case and showed her the movement running. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "It sounds like him." Wade did not ask her to explain that. He understood it. He closed the case and wrapped it in a soft cloth, and she paid him and put it back in the velvet pouch and into her coat pocket, and thanked him in a way that had nothing to do with the transaction and everything to do with the thing the transaction had made possible, which was the continuation of her father's presence in a form she could carry. After she left, Wade stood at the counter for a moment and thought about what it meant to fix something. Not the mechanism of it, but the meaning of it. A thing that runs keeps time. A thing that keeps time is still present. A thing that is still present is not entirely gone. His grandfather had understood this. Elias Carver had spent 60 years making that argument with his hands. The groundbreaking ceremony did not happen Friday morning. Mercer Capital issued a brief statement through Pierce, saying the event had been postponed due to unforeseen legal matters requiring review. The construction crew that had been staged at the town hall site stood down at 7:15 Friday morning and was gone by 8. Ada Flynn got the statement and published it on the Calhoun Courier website by 9, along with a brief factual account of the injunction and a photograph of the town hall building with the construction fence still around it. By Saturday afternoon, the story had been picked up by the Des Moines Register. By Sunday morning, it was on the AP wire. The details that emerged over the following 2 weeks came from public filings and from Dix's office and from the deposition that Roy Slade eventually gave, which was not entirely voluntary, but was in the end thorough. Roy had known since 2020, when he was first contracted to assess the town hall property for Mercer Capital, that the 1968 Harlan deed contained an encumbering covenant. His father, Bernard, had told him when Roy was in his 20s, told him as a cautionary tale about the kind of legal complications that could haunt a property. Told him with the specific detail of a man who knew the story from personal involvement. Roy had not known about the photographic reproduction or the affidavit. He had believed, as his father had believed, that the original deed and all copies had been destroyed in the 1971 fire. He had sold his knowledge to Mercer Capital as a solved problem, a property with a clouded title that he had cleared by confirming the original documents were gone. He had not known about Elias Carver. He had not known that the old clockmaker had spent an afternoon in August of 1971 with a commercial document camera before the fire and had spent an evening in September of 1972 writing down what he had witnessed, and had spent the following months designing a steel box to fit the interior of a specific clock, and had spent a day in the spring of 1972 installing it in the lobby of the rebuilt town hall, while his 16-year-old grandson stood watch at the door, not knowing what he was guarding. Roy had spent 18 months trying to get the clock opened or transferred without appearing to do so, and he had finally succeeded in putting it into the hands of the one man in Grayfall who had any chance of actually getting it open, because the one man who could get it open was also, as it happened, the one man who would know what to do with what was inside. Elias Carver had anticipated this, or something like it. He had not known the specific mechanism, but he had trusted the general principle, which was that a thing built right and placed right will eventually find its way to the right result if it is given enough time. Mercer Capital's attorneys attempted 3 separate legal strategies over the following 6 weeks. The first challenged the validity of the covenant on the grounds that it had not been properly disclosed in subsequent transactions, which was true but irrelevant because the failure of disclosure did not extinguish the covenant. It simply meant each subsequent transaction had been made without full information. The second challenged the photographic reproduction's admissibility as evidence of the original deed's contents, which Dix disposed of, by noting that the reproduction had been notarized in 1972 by a licensed notary, and that the chain of custody from the clock to the county attorney's office had been documented at every step. The third and most revealing challenged the authority of the county to void the 2022 transfer on the grounds that the covenant had been dormant for over 50 years and could be considered effectively abandoned. The judge who heard that argument was not the Des Moines judge who had signed the emergency court order. She was a Calhoun County Circuit Court judge named Margaret Voss, who had been on the bench for 22 years, and who was familiar with the Harlan family, having gone to high school with 2 of Harold Harlan's grandchildren. She disposed of the abandonment argument in 2 paragraphs of a written ruling, the relevant sentence of which read, "A covenant does not abandon itself by waiting and the inability of interested parties to locate the document. Establishing the covenant does not constitute waiver on the part of the beneficiary." Mercer Capital settled in January. The terms were not fully public, but the broad outline became known in the way that things become known in small Iowa counties, which is to say that Gerald Dix mentioned certain aspects to certain colleagues who mentioned them to others until the shape of the thing was generally understood. Mercer Capital returned the town hall property to the municipality and received back the $4.2 million they had paid for it. The project financing collapsed when the underlying asset disappeared. The Des Moines Business Journal ran a follow-up piece that was considerably less favorable than the groundbreaking preview had been. Gideon Mercer was not quoted in it. Pierce left Mercer Capital's retainer in February. Roy Slade closed Slade Property Solutions in March, citing personal reasons, and moved to Omaha. The estate of Bernard Slade, Roy's father, who had died in 2003, could not be held liable for actions taken in 1971. But the deposition became part of the public record, and the public record, as it tends to do, said what it said, without regard for who it was inconvenient to. Dale Briggs, the man who had laughed at the auction and said Wade had stopped moving forward, came into the shop in December. He came in with a Westclock's mantel clock under his arm that he said had belonged to his mother and had not run in 15 years. He set it on the counter without ceremony and looked at it, and then looked at Wade and said he was hoping Wade could take a look at it when he had time. Wade looked at the clock. It was a mid-century Sessions model, nothing rare but well made for what it was, and repairable without question. He said he could have it ready in a week. Dale said that was fine. He stood at the counter for a moment, and it was clear he had something else he intended to say. and was working out how to say it. He was not a man built for the kind of conversation he was trying to have, which was the kind where a large person who has been publicly wrong admits it to a quieter person who has been publicly right in a room where the quieter person has every advantage. He said, "I shouldn't have said what I said at the auction." Wade wrote the intake information in the ledger. He wrote the date and the make and the customer name and the condition of the case and the probable service needs without looking up. He said, "Dale, you weren't the only one." Dale said no, but he had been the loudest. Wade looked up. He said, "The clock's running now. That's what matters." Dale nodded. He was a man who understood that some things get resolved without being fully discussed, and that this was probably one of those things. He left, and the bell above the door rang once, and then the shop was quiet again. The town council voted in February to retain the town hall property and to allocate a portion of the returned funds to a restoration study for the building. The vote was 7-0. The council member who moved the resolution said in her remarks that the town had been given an unexpected second chance to decide what it wanted the corner of Gray Falls main block to be, and that it seemed worth taking the decision seriously this time. Wade was not at that meeting. He had not attended a town council meeting in 42 years. He did not start again now. But Francis called him after and told him about the motion and the vote, and he sat with the phone in his hand for a moment and thought about a woman named Patricia Doane, who had sat very straight in a council chamber in 1975 and said the covenant would protect the town in perpetuity. And he thought she had been right, and that being right about something and having it matter were two different things separated by a very long distance that required the right kind of patience to cross. He spent the winter working on the Gray Fall clock. It was the most significant restoration he had undertaken in 20 years. Possibly the most significant of his career, though he did not think about it in those terms. He thought about it in the terms available to him, which were practical and specific. The movement needed a complete cleaning and fresh oil at every pivot point. The suspension spring needed replacement. The beat needed to be set, and the regulation adjusted. The pendulum rod had a slight bend from its decades of resting against the backstop, and he spent 2 careful sessions straightening it by hand on the bench, a degree of correction at a time, checking after each adjustment with a straight edge. The casing needed attention too, though Wade was not a cabinet maker and knew the limits of his competence. He cleaned the charred surface and stabilized the wood where the fire damage had gone deeper than the surface. And he replaced the 2 sections of molding that had warped beyond recovery with pieces cut from matching oak by a furniture restorer in Iowa City who understood old joinery. The man drove to Gray Fall to see the clock in person before he cut a single piece of wood. Wade respected that. The brass face was another matter. The warping was significant and irreversible without replacement, and replacement would mean a reproduction rather than the original. Wade was not willing to do that. He cleaned the face and polished it as far as it would go, and left the warp where it was, because the warp was part of what the clock had survived, and a thing that has survived something carries the evidence of that survival in its body, the way a man carries his history in his face, and there is a kind of dishonesty in erasing it. He replaced the hands with a matched set sourced from a horological supply house in Pennsylvania, the correct style for an Ansonia tower of this period. He set the pendulum in motion on a Thursday morning in late February, a cold, bright day with a hard light coming through the east window of the shop, and stood back and listened to the first full beat of the Graham deadbeat escapement after 53 years of silence. Tick, pause, tick. The movement ran without protest. The beat was even. The regulation would need fine adjustment over the following days as the movement settled, but the fundamental action was sound. Elias had built the box to keep the documents safe. The fire had not touched the movement. The movement had been waiting in the way that a well-made thing waits, with nothing so active as hope and nothing so passive as indifference. Only the mechanical readiness of something designed to run when conditions permitted. Conditions now permitted. Wade let it run all day. The town council formally accepted the clock on a Saturday morning in April, at a small ceremony in the parking lot of the town hall, because the building itself was still under assessment and not yet open. It was a cold morning, but clear, with a sky the color of old silver and a wind that kept trying to take people's hats. About 40 people came, which for a Saturday morning in Grayfall was a significant number. Francis was there. Gerald Dix was there. Judith Akers from the recorder's office was there. Ada Flynn was there with a camera. Lorraine Briggs from Marshalltown was there, which surprised Wade, though, when he thought about it later. He supposed it did not surprise him very much. There was a small wooden podium that someone had brought from the Lutheran church. The council chair, a man named Howard Finch, who farmed 800 acres east of town and had been on the council for 11 years, said a few words about the history of the clock and the history of the building and the legal situation and what it meant for the town's future. He was brief and accurate and did not say anything that was not true, which Wade appreciated. Then he looked at Wade and said he understood the restoration had been done by Wade Carver of Carver Clock and Watch Repair on Depot Street, and that the town owed Mr. Carver a debt it was not sure how to repay. Wade was standing at the back of the small crowd. He was wearing his dark wool coat and his canvas work cap, and he had his hands in his coat pockets. He nodded once. He did not go to the podium. Howard Finch said the town had voted to name the clock the Elias Carver Regulator, in honor of the man who had preserved what needed to be preserved when preserving it was not easy or safe. The 40 people in the parking lot applauded. Wade stood at the back and let them. He thought about his grandfather in the summer of 1971, a man in his 60s with large, careful hands who had decided that certain things were worth protecting, even if protecting them meant carrying a risk alone and in silence for as long as the protection required. He thought about the afternoon at the commercial document camera, and the September evening with the notary, and the spring morning in the rebuilt lobby with the 16-year-old boy at the door. He thought about what it costs a man to do something he knows will not be recognized in his lifetime, and he thought that Elias Carver had done it anyway. Not because recognition was coming, but because the thing was right, and the clock would last, and the right person would eventually come. The ceremony lasted 22 minutes. When it was done, 2 men from the town public works crew loaded the clock carefully onto a flatbed truck for transport to the Grayfall Public Library, where it would stand in the main reading room while the town hall restoration was completed. Wade watched them strap it down. He watched them check the straps and check them again. They were thorough, and they were careful. And when they were satisfied, they signaled to the driver, and the truck moved slowly out of the parking lot and turned onto Depot Street. Wade stood in the emptying parking lot and watched it go. Frances came and stood beside him. She did not say anything for a moment. She had known Wade for long enough to understand that he was not a man who needed the silence filled. After a while, she said, Elias would have been pleased. Wade thought about that. He thought about his grandfather's face, which he could recall with the completeness that comes from having studied a face during years when a face is the most important thing in the world to a boy. The years when a man who knows things and takes you seriously is the most valuable person in your life. He thought about the way Elias looked when a movement he had been working on finally ran correctly. A look that was not triumph, but something quieter and more durable. The look of a man who has done what he set out to do and found the doing of it sufficient. He said, I think he'd have gone straight back to the bench. Frances smiled. She said that sounded right. She said goodbye and walked to her car. The parking lot was empty now except for Wade and the wind and the orange construction notices still zip-tied to the chain-link fence lifting and settling in the cold April air. Wade stood there for another few minutes. He thought about the clock in the truck running now, carrying its corrected time through the streets of Grayfall toward the library reading room, where it would stand among books and people, and the particular quality of silence that libraries hold. A silence made of accumulated attention rather than emptiness. He thought about children who would put their hands flat on the oak casing, the way children always touch clocks drawn by the sound inside, and would ask their parents what it was, and their parents would tell them. He thought about the movement inside the Graham deadbeat escapement, with its even authoritative beat running now, as it had been built to run measuring the forward passage of time, with the precision that Elias had always said was a form of respect. Respect for the fact that time moves in one direction, and that direction matters. He put his cap back on and turned up his collar against the wind. He walked back to Depot Street. The shop was exactly as he had left it on a Saturday morning, with the sign turned to open, and the bell above the door and the bench lamp on and the movements running on the wall. The Seth Thomas was done and wrapped and waiting for its owner on the shelf behind the counter. The Hamilton Railroad watch had been picked up. The anniversary clock with the bent suspension spring was running on the bench under a glass dome, where it would stay for 3 days, while he confirmed the regulation before he called the owner. There was a new clock on the counter that had arrived Friday afternoon, an old Sessions schoolhouse clock in a pressed oak case, the kind that had hung in classrooms across the Midwest for the first half of the last century. Its owner, a man of about 70 who had driven from Cedar Falls, had set it on the counter and said it had been his teacher's clock and she had left it to him when she died and it had not run in 8 years, and he would like very much for it to run again. Wade had taken it in and written the intake entry and told the man it would be ready in 2 weeks. He sat down on his stool and put on his magnifying headset and opened the Seth Thomas service log to close it out, and then opened a new page for the Sessions school clock and began his preliminary examination. Outside on Depot Street, the April morning was moving through its ordinary business cars, passing a delivery truck, stopping at the hardware 2 doors down, someone walking a dog on the far sidewalk. Inside the shop, the movements ran. The bench lamp made its small, steady light. The smell was clock oil and old wood, and the particular metallic cold of a space that is kept at a working temperature rather than a comfortable one. Wade had been in this room for most of his adult life. He would be in it for whatever came next. He was not a man given to large conclusions about the meaning of things. He had spent 60 years in a trade that required him to think small, to think precisely, to think about the distance between a pivot and a jewel, and what happened in that distance when the conditions were right. What he knew from 60 years of thinking that way was that a thing built right does not stop being right when it becomes inconvenient, that a document does not stop being true when it becomes lost, that a covenant does not abandon itself by waiting, that a movement given oil and time and an honest hand will run, that a man who listens carefully enough will hear what the gears are saying. He set the Sessions school clock on the bench in front of him and put his fingertips to the case and listened. Then he picked up his tools and got to work.